Dictatorships don't have a very long shelf life. The Soviet Union was nearly 70 years old when it collapsed. China's government's now only 73 years old, and it's only beaten by other dictatorships, North Korea and Vietnam. China's now seeing the largest protests it's seen since Tiananmen Square, except these ones are much more widespread and diverse in the people that make up the protests. Cause of the protests are pretty simple. People are basically fed up with 3 years of zero COVID, which hasn't worked very well. Under the current dictatorship, most people have been locked down maybe 6 or 7 times over the last 3 years, if they were lucky. And they also have to do swab tests, usually every 3 days, but sometimes every day if you're in a high-risk area. And basically, for a long time, people were hoping that Xi Jinping would reform and change his mind once he got to the 20th National Congress. They thought, well, he needs to save face and keep up the policy up until then, because then he'll have secured his power, and then he'll be able to relax and change the policy. And instead, the opposite happened. At the Congress, instead of being a little more relaxed about it, he basically removed anybody who had a different opinion to him. So all of the previous liberal-minded members of the committee are now gone. And the former president, Hu Jintao, was dragged out by Xi Jinping's bodyguard. Basically what seems like a dictator's purge, similar to what Saddam Hussein and Kim Jong-un would have done. A couple of weeks after this, the government announced a new wave of full lockdowns. And this coincided with a fire that killed about 44 people in an apartment in Urumqi in Xinjiang. So for a lot of people, this was kind of the final straw. At this time, people had been locked down for nearly 3 or 4 months in Urumqi. People had been locked down for months on end, obviously in Shanghai earlier this year, but in basically almost every city in China at some point has gone through 3 or 4 lockdowns, and sometimes closer to 8 or 9. And some people, if they were in a high-risk area, have spent a majority of the last 3 years in some kind of lockdown. And for people who aren't well off, who aren't rich, it's been absolutely devastating. I mean, you can see the hopelessness of these protests in their voices. You know, they've got nothing to lose, some of them. They don't have money to buy food. They need the QR code to ride the subway to get to work. And so these movements spread to almost every corner of the country. And they included explicit denunciations of Xi Jinping himself, calling him to step down, calling him names, something which didn't even happen during Tiananmen Square. They were actually very reluctant to say the names of the leaders. They were basically protesting against corruption and inflation in 1989, but this time it's very different, and it shows how things have changed politically in China since then. People are actually a little bit more aware of the specific problems of the CCP. And so obviously these movements have drawn many comparisons to the Tiananmen Square protests, but like I said, these ones are much more widespread. They've seen mass protests in at least nearly 30 cities and over 100 university campuses. And, you know, the speed of it was insane. It basically took 2 days for this to spread. The government didn't really know what to do. Since then, they've cracked down a lot and announced that they'd loosen most of the policies. It has been loosened and relaxed in many cities, but it's got stricter in others like Beijing and Shanghai. So the policies are basically very contradictory. This seems to show that Xi Jinping basically doesn't know what to do. He's trying to have it both ways. I think he really is trying to plan to open up the country, but doesn't want to do it quickly, and that's why you have this dithering. He also kind of hilariously told some EU officials that these protests were caused by frustrated students angry with zero COVID policies. He sort of forgot about the propaganda line that it's all caused by foreign forces. Clearly he wasn't expecting this to be reported in the press, which is why he was so angry at Justin Trudeau when the same thing happened, earlier at G20. It's annoying for him because he wants to seem like an intelligent leader on the world stage. So he tells them the real reason things are happening, but he's not happy when this gets leaked out to the press and people in China might hear about it. You see, it's not fair. It's very hard being a dictator. In the end, Xi Jinping's probably going to do whatever he thinks will keep him in power. But I think there's a bigger question of what will these protests ultimately lead to? Will they have any result? Because I think there's a big change in political consciousness in China. The fact that people are openly criticizing the government in almost all sections of society. And so I wanted to go through some different scenarios about what could happen in the wake of these protests and talk about how likely each scenario is. So, let's just get into some of the scenarios, and you can tell me in the comments if you think these are likely or not. I've given them kind of likeliness ratings, so you could tell me if you agree or not. The first scenario is a full Xi Jinping victory. And in this situation, the protests stop, they die down, the lockdowns come back, and basically zero COVID successful. China becomes a rapidly growing economy once again, and Xi Jinping remains in power, secures his legacy, and appoints a successor, maybe Chen Minar, someone like that, and the CCP's, going strong and dominates the world. So I'd give this maybe a 2% chance. I'm tempted to give it a 0 because I think achieving actual zero COVID is impossible. But there is a scenario where maybe the government fumbles along with relatively low infection rates in the future. But I think realistically that the longer these things carry on, the worse the economy gets and the more the government's just running out of money to enforce the policies. And it's really hard to overstate how bad this has been for the Chinese economy. So that's why I'd give it such a low score. Okay, scenario 2. Subtle Xi Jinping reform and the CCP continues. So this is a situation where basically what seems to be happening now. Xi Jinping is able to kind of subtly adjust the policies and say, look, zero COVID was a great success. In reality, they vaccinate, they open up, and China goes back to something that's relatively normal, where most people are vaccinated, the death rates are not that high. Even if they are, well, they could just lie about it and say no one died. So in this situation, the CCP still looks quite good, and things go back to normal. People are mostly satisfied with this, and so the protests die down. There is a high likelihood of this happening, definitely in the short run. I think these protests could go away and we might not see anything similar to them for a long time. But in the long term, I think things will change. Basically, I think the censorship state and the COVID state that's been developed, it's a little bit convenient for the government, and I think they're unlikely to want to remove it because it makes it so easy to crack down on protests. So I think there's a high likelihood that they'll turn a lot of these COVID quarantine centers into basically labor camps or temporary prisons and just use them to imprison dissidents, or just say that there are deadlier COVID strains still going around China. So if you're infected with it, you need to go to these camps because it creates the level of control that they want for the future. And I think also the government is now so centralized around Xi that they're likely to make other mistakes in the future that will lead to more protests. So I think ultimately things will probably bubble over again. But I would give this scenario a relatively high chance of around maybe 30%. Okay, scenario 3. Drastic or violent Xi reform. So in this scenario, this would be very similar to what happened after the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989, where the protests get bigger and bigger and bigger until eventually they threaten the overthrow of the government, and the CCP make the decision to shoot the protesters or kill them in some other way. And some people might think that this is very likely, that some problems continue in the future, protests get very big, and they're killed and nothing ultimately changes. Of course, it's a big possibility. It happened in 1989. But I think there are some reasons to be cautiously optimistic. The first one that I mentioned is the widespread nature of the protests. So unlike 1989, which was mostly concentrated in Beijing and a few other cities, these protests are very decentralized. They're in cities from Xinjiang to Zhejiang to Guangzhou. They're all over the country. And while those protests were mostly student-led, these ones led by almost every member of society. So you have angry workers in Zhengzhou factories, you have like middle-class residents in regular cities, or you have, wealthier students. Even members of the party themselves are implicitly supporting many of the protesters, something which the regime is very, very scared of. It's also worth mentioning that the regime actually became very close to being overthrown in 1989. Several PLA generals supported the protesters and called on Deng Xiaoping to resign, or at least change the party policies. Zhao Ziyang, who was general secretary at the time, he explicitly supported the protesters, the students, but he went on a trip to North Korea, and in those crucial few weeks, the hardliners took over the government and initiated the crackdown. But if he hadn't done that, if he'd coordinated with the PLA generals, things could have turned out very differently. There are actually many situations in which this could have happened differently. I mean, one example is in the same year, 1989, the Romanian dictator Ceausescu called a speech where he had a huge rally to address his dwindling support. And during the rally, instead of cheering for him, the protesters started to boo him and turn against him, and then rioted and entered the parliament building. Ceausescu, the dictator, gave orders for his soldiers to shoot the protesters, and instead they turned on him and arrested him, and he was shot a few days later.
Populare din București, considerând aceasta ca o
That's a model for what could happen to the CCP. It's something I think they fear above almost everything. Everything the CCP does is designed to prevent this situation from happening, but the same protests that are happening were meant to be impossible. So although I think a huge Tiananmen-style crackdown is still likely, it might not be as likely as it was then, so I'd maybe give it a 20% chance. Scenario 4, Taiwan war scenario. So I think, unfortunately, if the protests grow and keep getting bigger, which I think they will, I think a war with Taiwan becomes increasingly likely, because Xi Jinping might just decide that the only way he can stay in power and shore up some support is to attempt a Taiwan invasion and get some kind of militaristic success there. This would let him declare full martial law and conscript all of the protesters and send them off to war. So even though the PLA would probably lose a war with Taiwan, or at least not accomplish very much, Xi's recent announcements at the Congress seem to point to the fact that they don't feel particularly confident that they would win a war with Taiwan. This might be something that comes a kind of a plan B, something to shore up power when all else fails. As we've seen from Putin's regime in Russia, dictators don't always judge their chances of success very logically, and so Xi might feel that he's able to learn from the mistakes of Russia and he can succeed where they failed. So unfortunately, I would give this outcome a relatively high, maybe 20% chance of happening. Of course, if the protests get too big, the PLA will be too busy suppressing their own citizens to bother with a war in Taiwan, but, until then, it might be something that becomes increasingly likely. Okay, scenario 5, the coup scenario. So many people will claim that the CCP's surveillance state is so strong that it's basically immune from a coup d'etat or any kind of political plot, because if anybody starts to communicate, say something about overthrowing the dictator, they'll be found out. But I'd like to remind everybody that people said the same thing about the protests that are happening right now. These protests were meant to be impossible for the exact same reasons. It's the biggest surveillance state in history, but it's actually not working, really. These protests are still happening. It's also worth noting that the CCP itself made many claims of coup attempts in the past. For example, when the Zhou Yongcan group were arrested in 2014, the state media made claims that this group were plotting a coup against the party. And it said the same thing when it arrested Sun Zhengcai, the Chongqing official, in 2017, and his supporters. And recently there have been many rumors of coup attempts and even assassination attempts on the Chinese internet. These are probably overblown, but there are many kind of signs like Xi Jinping cancelling meetings, vanishing at short notice, rapidly changing schedules, random explosions in military bases, which seem to point to the foundation of Zhongnanhai not being as stable as they might appear on the outside. The Soviet Union experienced many coup attempts. Nikita Khrushchev in 1964 was basically ousted by the KGB. Several other leaders experienced attempts. Gorbachev narrowly survived a coup attempt in 1991 and was then forced to resign quickly afterwards. So there is a precedent for this happening several times in the Soviet Union. So there's no reason to think really it couldn't happen in China. But maybe it's unlikely, so I'd give it maybe a 15% chance. At least while Xi Jinping is still alive. I think if his health starts to fail, the chance goes up significantly. Scenario 6, full government overthrow. So in this scenario, the protests grow so big that the government miscalculates in some way, leading to the actual breakup of the CCP and the replacement with a new government. Some people might think this is the least likely of all, previously mentioned things like the surveillance state or the Tiananmen Square precedent. But like I mentioned, there are examples where this kind of did happen in similar regimes, like Ceausescu's regime in Romania. It's also worth looking at the situation in Iran today. There, the government repeatedly is shooting protesters every few days, but the protests are continuing to escalate every day. They've been going on for nearly 3 months. There were recent outbreaks of protests in breakaway regions in Russia, Dagestan, and both Putin and the Ayatollah Khomeini are older and allegedly sicker than Xi Jinping. And if one of these regimes falls, it could create a kind of domino effect. where it basically inspires revolutions in one of the other two countries, which is also something the CCP is very afraid of. I want to also bring up the example of the Qing dynasty in the early 1900s. The Qing dynasty opened fire on many peaceful protesters before it was overthrown finally in 1911. They basically shot, student demonstrations, striking workers that were being supported by Sun Yat-sen, who was in exile. They did this like 7 or 8 times before the revolution. There was a strike of railway workers in Wuhan in 1911. When they were shot, people revolted, took over the local government, and then the military stepped in to retake the city. But the army mutinied and shot their own generals, and it became a countrywide revolution. And although it took quite a few years for the Kuomintang to consolidate power, they were able to overthrow the Qing dynasty. So this is actually a fairly interesting model of how the CCP could end. And it shows that just shooting your citizens is not a surefire way to stay in power forever. But it could be relatively low, so I would give it a chance, at least now, of around 10% chance. I think the other ones are much more likely. There are several variations on this scenario which could involve breakaway regions, like what happened at the end of the Soviet Union. And even China in the 1920s, you had a kind of period where warlords took over several regions of China. So it's, this is only 100 years ago, fairly recent history, this was happening. Final scenario, government overthrow and a new dictatorship. So in this scenario, something happens similar to what happened in Russia, where the CCP is overthrown, but it's replaced by another dictatorship. Maybe another nationalist party with a kind of Putin-like figure who engages in similar policies of state repression and military aggression. Someone like, Han Zheng, one of the officials that make up the Politburo currently. So it might not seem that unlikely, but I think there are reasons to think it won't happen. And the first is that in recent history, you have many more benign, relatively liberal political figures in the Chinese government. People like Li Keqiang, Wen Jiabao, and even Wang Yang, who were kind of reformist ministers who were in the Politburo, very recently. They would have a lot of public support basically after Xi dies. I think the party would react very strongly after Xi's death and basically demand some kind of reform to at least make things the way they were before 2018 when term limits were removed. China does have experience of democracy. So in the 1910s, it organized, an election that the Kuomintang won. And it now has millions and millions of students who were educated abroad who I think would be keen to play a part in this kind of new democratic Chinese system. So I think on balance, a reforming China is actually a little bit more likely after Xi Jinping than a kind of revisionist, militarist China, like Putin after the Soviet Union. So I'd give this kind of new dictatorship maybe a 3% chance. Okay, so maybe there are other scenarios I haven't considered, or maybe there are combinations of these scenarios that might occur, or you think, my likeliness ratings are way off. Let me know in the comments, and yeah, thanks for watching.